Hello everyone, happy Wednesday and welcome to today's regulatory roundup where, as always, I'm joined by Jimmy Franklin.
Hello everyone.
And a warm welcome to Vixio's new Head of Payments Compliance, John Gidler.
Hi everyone.
So today we'll be looking back at some of the more interesting and noteworthy regulatory developments impacting the global payments industry over the past month. So in April 2024, according to Vixio's regulatory horizon scanning tool, there were 188 new regulatory updates relevant to the global payments industry, 44 of which our analysts deemed to be actionable. In terms of regulatory deadlines, we saw 49 new laws and regulations come into effect and 33 consultations close. Over the next 30 minutes or so, the three of us will be unpacking some of these one region at a time, departing as always from the UK via Europe, through the Middle East, Africa, onto Asia, before finishing in the Americas. So Jimmy, I know you wanted to sort of sink your teeth into what's been happening over at the FCA. So why don't we start there?
Yeah, absolutely. So quite a controversial thing, and I think it's been quite hard to avoid on LinkedIn or anywhere else in the last few weeks. But the reaction to the FCA's name and shame plans. These were originally consulted on in February, and the consultation closed last month. So with these, with this idea, the FCA wants to potentially name some companies that it is investigating, and it has not gone down well with practically anybody. I think there are some reasons for the FCA to want to do this. Obviously, there's kind of the consumer protection side of things. Let's say if you're, a bad actor and you are suddenly, and maybe it's good that customers would know, especially if there's compelling evidence. And I think there's also the argument that whistleblowers will be able to come forward quicker on it if they were to name companies. But at the same time, these investigations go on a long time, which, is, I think the FCA has garnered some notoriety for. And also there's the risk of basically firms going out of business because of this. You can't sue the FCA, so they can be completely
I googled that actually a minute ago.
Yeah,
turns out you can't sue the FCA. So you're not really innocent until proven guilty. It's almost the other way around. John, you used to work for the FCA. I don't know what you can say on this without getting in trouble, but what's your view on it?
Well, I mean, there's two lenses on it. I definitely think it's not favourable to go down this route. The whole idea of being innocent until proven guilty is certainly a big point. But I also think the element for businesses, the reputational damage that it could cause, and kind of the inverse of consumer protection. Consumers may get worried about an ongoing enforcement case, but actually the outcome of that may be that the firm was innocent. So the detriment to both the consumer having to move business and then the actual organization having to lose effectively their bottom line in terms of profit.
And I suppose this can have a knock-on effect if a business is operating internationally in other jurisdictions, right? If I'm getting investigated by the FCA and I'm registered in I don't know, Lithuania or Belgium or whatever, maybe that regulator starts looking at me closer.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that would make things even worse. I mean, especially post-Brexit, a lot of companies that are operating in the UK are also operating in a member state in the EU. And a lot of those member states kind of look up to the FCA because it is a very reputable regulator. So if they see the FCA is investigating someone, they're going to think, oh, we need to do that as well. So I think that is really bad. And someone I was speaking to in the money sector was saying, in an industry like payments, once trust is gone, very hard to get it back.
Yeah, absolutely, especially on the consumer side. And so now the FCA has essentially got a decision to make, right? Does it back down or does it listen to the industry and find some sort of middle ground, essentially?
And there is a lot of pressure for them to back down, even from the Chancellor now has got involved.
Yes, I noticed that.
UK Finance said that it's going to really negatively impact global competitiveness. So no one is happy about this at all in the industry. I feel like with it kind of brings into question the independence of the FCA if they are to back down, which I think makes it very hard. And they have gone ahead of other things in the past that everyone's kicked off about, such as the consumer duty.
Yeah.
There was definitely murmurings that the Treasury weren't best pleased about the consumer duty when it was in the process of being introduced. So, they have got form on this.
Interesting. I also noticed, whilst we're on the subject of the FCA, that it recently announced that it said there are no plans to speed up the registration process for UK crypto firms, essentially asking that a slower pace is necessary for quality control. I suppose given what's happened, FTX and other places, you can kind of see their point on that. I think that they have potentially received a few complaints that the bar's set maybe too high. If you look at the data, you'll see that since January 2020, 344 firms have applied to register and only 45 have been successful. So about 90% typically either get their applications refused or withdraw. John, from your perspective, is the FCA being too stringent here, or do you think this is good? It sets a precedent for the safety of the kind of crypto market in the UK.
So I think from my perspective, both working at the FCA and as a consultant, I think what we're missing there is the actual number of firms that have had to withdraw, and that's probably due to the fact that their application wasn't fit for purpose. There's another element where it's typically explored, which is knowledge and experience, which is always a key area during authorizations, where the compliance officer or the person in charge might not necessarily be able to articulate what's going on in their business in terms of their anti-money laundering controls, in terms of their onboarding procedures, complaint handling, and so on and so forth. So I think they're doing the right thing in terms of pushing it forward and kind of staying stringent in how they react. But I think there is an element where there needs to be a level of proportionality, but we're always stifled by the fact that you see a big organization go down and you see some issues in industry, which always then goes back to how did they come into the market in the first place, which will be the gateway.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, on the balance, you probably putting consumers first. You don't want that to happen again. So yeah, makes sense. Hopping across the channel now, in Europe, there's been quite a lot that's happened in the EU this month, Ginny, that's caught your eye. You've been down in Brussels. What's been going on?
So the European Parliament is now effectively in election mode. We're at the end of the mandate, which means everything is about to change. But before that, in the final weeks of the mandate, some interesting payment stuff did happen. So, for example, MEPs passed their initial position on the Open Finance Framework, otherwise known as the Financial Data Access Regulation, or FIDA. And in their position, MEPs on the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee did say that digital platforms designated as gatekeepers under the EU's Digital Markets Act, which is one of the signature laws that I think was passed in this mandate, should to become financial information service providers, and that would exclude huge companies such as Meta or ByteDance, or TikTok and Facebook, as well as Alphabet and Amazon from benefiting from the Open Finance Framework, which has not gone down well at all. A bit of a cup of cold sick, basically, for a lot of lobbyists in Brussels. And I was quite surprised when I saw it, because it's definitely a big move to make. I don't know whether it will make it to the trilogues, because I think this is going to definitely mean that a lot of companies who potentially could benefit consumers as well, would be locked out of this regulation.
So the rationale is we're trying to promote competition, but we're going to exclude this group of very, very large companies from participating in this.
Yeah, and my theory, and this isn't backed up by anyone, but is that MEPs may be trying to learn from what they perceive as mistakes with PSD2, because obviously post PSD2, suddenly big tech firms really moved into payments, and the EU couldn't do anything about it, which I don't think they particularly liked, because at the moment there is this huge emphasis on sovereignty in the EU, and we've seen that throughout the last 5 years, or I think basically ever since Trump came in, or President Trump, there was a real concern about needing to bring things onshore in the UK, in the EU, for security reasons, and that included payments. So that's why you have the big push for the European Payments Initiative, and now all the work that's happening on digital euro, which the European Parliament was incredibly quiet on towards the end. So I don't think anyone's really still knowing what that is.
Yeah, that feels like it's reached a bit of a, I don't know, stalling is the right word, or they're just going to wait and see.
I think that probably is the right word. Yeah.
Interesting. moving on, like every month, we'll kind of cover DORA and MiCA and the implementation of it. And quite a lot's happened over the past month. So the ESAs have confirmed a voluntary dry run exercise to prepare the financial services industry for the next stage of implementation of DORA. Essentially, beginning in May, financial entities' contractual arrangements on the use of IT third-party service providers under DORA, and starting from 2025, payments, e-money institutions, banks, crypto asset service providers will have to maintain registers of information regarding their use of IT service providers. And in this dry run exercise, this information is essentially going to be collected through competent authorities and will serve as a way of preparing firms. We've also seen various member states starting to implement this into their law. So the Estonian Ministry of Finance has introduced the Crypto Asset Market Bill to the Estonian Parliament. It also contains provisions on digital resilience. So it's not the first time we've seen kind of MiCA and DORA regulation being passed together. The German Ministry of Finance has published a draft of the accompanying ordinance to transfer the existing legal framework with regards to crypto assets. Again, this is around essentially making sure the authorization process for applications is streamlined across the EU. The Spanish Ministry of Economy, Trade and Enterprise has launched a public consultation, essentially with the goal of transposing both MiCA and DORA. And the Maltese Parliament has transposed MiCA into national law. I've also noticed quite a lot actually going on in Malta with regards to the MFSA. They're just consulting on technical standards around DORA as well. We've also seen in Hungary, they've adopted MiCA and DORA into their national law effective end of June. Finland has published a notice to provide information on the entry into force of MiCA, among other things. And there's also Poland, which is amending laws around digital resilience to embed DORA there. So lots going on.
Absolutely. And I think, MiCA and DORA are the big words pretty much from the financial services sector at the moment in the EU. People are very, very excited about actually being able to implement these, I'm sure. I'm wondering whether we're going to see at places like Money 2020 and EBA Day in the next month when conference season comes up, people talking about things like MiCA, because it is technically an opportunity for a lot of firms and a lot of banks as well. And one thing I'm wondering is where we're going to see crypto firms going. Are they going to go to places like Malta, where there's already a pretty good framework in place, same with Estonia, or are they going to go to other jurisdictions that perhaps have a bit more trust of the regulators, for example, places like France or Spain? So it's going to be interesting to see once MiCA actually becomes enforceable next year.
I've seen one of the sort of contentious points around DORA that's creating a lot of challenges for compliance teams is the banks they're working with, they interpret DORA in one way, and then they try and enforce a risk management policy onto them. But then if every bank is doing that in a slightly different way, then you're that e-money or payment institution. Which policy do you choose to adapt to? So I think they're struggling to figure out, okay, how do I push back? Which bits do I push back on?
And how soft touch are the regulators going to be with DORA and MiCA once they first come into force? Are we going to see fines and investigations happening instantly, or is there going to be a bit of breathing space? I think that will be one to watch next year.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a proportionality piece as well, both from the point you mentioned, Luke, in terms of how the banks are adopting it and how the e-money provider can effectively provide pushback, but as long as it's fit for purpose and looking at their business model outwards. And then I think in terms of the regulators, it'll be interesting to see. We never see fines, where as far as I can remember or recall, quite soon after an implementation. But these two have been, dare I say, one of the longest awaited pieces of legislation in a while. So it'll be interesting to see how it's embedded.
Yeah, and I think with MiCA, it's very straightforward, right? There's just like a cutoff, as in like if you haven't registered or if you don't have a license beyond this date, you cannot operate. Right. Whereas I think DORA's more on an operational front in terms of how they manage their suppliers. Right. I'm conscious of time, so we'll move on to the Middle East. And the DFSA, probably welcomed by most, has revised its AML and sanctions module. That came into effect a few days ago on May the 1st. These rules essentially supersede the previous version. Essentially, they cover every authorized firm operating in or from the DIFC. The key tenets of the regulations are, as you would typically expect, implement a compliance culture that cascades from senior management to the rest of the organization, use a risk-based approach to AML, conduct a tiered method of customer due diligence in accordance with the level of risk associated with a specific customer, establish a robust internal audit function, and so on. The regulations also specifically mention money service providers and include the requirement to maintain a complete list of all agents it uses to conduct money services businesses. This is quite interesting because it comes in close succession to the European Parliament approving a motion for So they've essentially sort of backed a regulation, or they've backed a resolution to object against a regulation that would remove the UAE from the list of the EU's high-risk countries.
Because that comes from the Financial Action Task Force's high-risk countries, or ones on the grey list.
But they were removed from the grey list, right?
Yeah, and the EU, well, the European Parliament rather, has wanted to keep them on the high-risk list in the EU, and they did the same with Gibraltar as well, which has been removed from a grey list. So it's it's interesting that we're seeing that, you know, at least in the EU's eyes, it's still a non-cooperative and I suppose country of poor standards when it comes to AML. I feel like part of this might be to do with the sanctions regime. I think there's a bit of a fear in the EU that the UAE is kind of harbouring Russian money, and I think that's what makes it so political in the European Parliament.
Yeah.
But you can definitely tell that the UAE is very keen to up its standards, and it has been for a while.
Yeah, I think I'm just sort of skimming over the regulations around AML. I'm not sure there was a huge amount in there about sanctions. Don't quote me on that. I'd have to look again. But yeah, maybe you've got a point there around the lack of kind of sanctions regulation. I guess on that same theme, I mean, there's a bit of a theme around AML, new AML regulations at the moment. And continuing on that theme, actually in South Africa, we noticed the Minister of Finance there has recently issued a consultation on the draft amendments to their AML regulations. So again, this raises or brings in new thresholds to trigger AML reporting, brings in new information reporting standards and timelines. And whilst we're in South Africa, and I think this came up on the webinar you guys were actually both on last week, the FSCA in South Africa has just released a long list of policy recommendations for open banking, which I think people are generally quite excited about.
Absolutely. I mean, the recommendations, they really seem to take from the UK and also Australia with the consumer data right? And basically what they're saying is they want to establish a regulated open finance regime, implement tailored and proportionate regulatory oversight over participants in open finance, and also require explicit informed consent when using customer data, among other things. So it's quite an interesting move from them, and I think people have been waiting for it for quite a long time. It shows that South Africa is one of those places that firms who want to move in this space should go, really.
Yeah.
I think they've also laid out a really interesting roadmap from 2024 October to 26 December. And then, as Jimmy mentioned, it's quite interesting that they've taken lessons learned from a number of jurisdictions, including the UK, India, to kind of effectively evolve what they have and build something that's sustainable.
Sort of learn from past mistakes.
Definitely. So I think it's an exciting opportunity and a very interesting place to be in open finance, open banking.
Yeah, and it's not the only jurisdiction. I think we'll come on a bit later to some others that are implementing. Now, jumping across to Asia Pacific, in Singapore, we noticed that the Monetary Authority of Singapore essentially has expanded the scope of regulatory activities and increased regulatory requirements under the Payment Services Act 2019. This includes domestic money transfer, cross-border money transfer, and digital payment tokens. Companies are essentially now required to examine the expanded scope of regulatory activities to determine whether they now come into scope of the Payment Services Act. I think you'll find that a lot of them will. And additional submission requirements for an appropriate license essentially must be completed by October the 4th. Also in Singapore, the Monetary Authority again released a new set of strict rules covering the protection of customer assets by crypto services. I think this is going to be something we're going to see again fallout from FTX. We're seeing this specifically when it comes to things like segregating customer assets, putting risk management systems in place, mitigating conflicts of interest, making disclosures to customers around how they give and receive instructions, and providing customers with a statement of accounts containing transaction details, etc. I think this is probably just going to be the general standard for crypto businesses handling customer money. And yeah, for those operating in Singapore, those guidelines will also come in on October the 4th. Also in Singapore's had a busy month. We noticed, and I thought this is quite interesting, it's launched a new information sharing platform for financial institutions called Cosmic. Essentially, it allows financial institutions to share customer information with each other. Previously, they could only share information with the regulators and law enforcement agencies, like in many other jurisdictions. But due to the high volume and the kind of information they were sharing, they saw this as a necessary way to kind of tackle financial crime. I think Singapore is one of those environments where perhaps it's easier to implement a framework like this. I'm not sure whether this is the kind of thing that would get through in Europe. But yeah, I think it'd be interesting to see over the next sort of 12, 18 months, does this bring financial crime down? I mean, I would guess that it does.
Absolutely, because I feel like in the EU and UK, there's perhaps some concerns, definitely, or at least more of a conversation will probably focus a bit more on things like data protection, which I can see people causing a bit of a fuss about. But I think this makes a lot of sense and should, hopefully reduce the levels of financial crime that can take place.
I mean, yeah, just to add to that, the whole world we're moving in terms of open banking, open finance, the next evolution would naturally allow the banks to talk to each other for the better of consumer protection. So I think it's a really positive initiative by Singapore, and it'd be interesting to see how things are adopted in other jurisdictions.
Fantastic. Right now, heading sort of south, I suppose, and the Australian Attorney General's Department has also released a consultation on feedback to modernise Australia's AML regime. I think the background to this is essentially there is a bit of danger that Australia could be placed on FATF's grey list when they next get reviewed in 2026, 2027, I think it is. I think since 2015, Australia has failed to comply with 16 out of 40 FATF standards. So I think this project is essentially part of a big investment from the Australian government to try and modernise that framework before that review comes in. And I think everyone can agree that being on the grey list for Australia is probably going to carry some pretty negative consequences, impact on GDP.
I think it would just be incredibly embarrassing for them.
Yeah,
end up in the same way that I remember when Malta went on to the grey list in the EU, and it was mortifying for people in Brussels, the fact that the EU had actually got someone on the grey list.
Yeah. And so it's worth just noting for those businesses operating in Australia, there's essentially sort of a few industries targeted. Paper 4 outlines information for digital currency exchange providers, remittance service providers, and financial institutions. And essentially it will cover the expansion of regulated digital currency related services. So currently, Australia only regulates exchanges between digital and fiat currency, and this proposal will essentially expand that to include everything regulated by FATF, even going a step further and looking at NFTs as well, which is something that I don't think Mika did do. Mika left NFTs out of scope. So that's quite interesting. Also, new fitness and proprietary changes for remittance and digital asset services. Again, I think this is just bringing it up to kind of FATF standards, and some various other Now, moving over to North America. Now, I know this was typically technically at the end of March, but we didn't cover it last time, and I thought it was worth mentioning that the CFPB in the US has warned remittance transfer providers that essentially falsely advertising about the cost or speed of sending a remittance transfer may violate federal law, including the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Financial Protection Act. According to the circular they released, remittance transfers include most electronic transfers sent by customers in the US to recipients in other countries. Basically, if you're a firm and you're in the remittance space and you're advertising things as no fee or free, it's worth just kind of checking and looking at your promotions, because according to the CFPB, you could be liable for deceptive marketing practices. And I don't think this is the first time we've seen remittance sort of transparency being called into question. I think this has been a bit of a theme in other places over the last few months as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the EU, the European Parliament did establish their position on the PSD3 and PSR, and some of that did focus on fee transparency and concerns about which would impact things like remittance.
Yeah, absolutely. And then at the state level in the US, so for those that aren't aware, the Money Transmission Modernization Act is a piece of regulation that came in a couple of years ago that aims to harmonize and modernize money transmission regulations across US states. It's generally a welcome piece of regulation, and different states are adopting it in different ways. So not quite harmonized in the true sense, but over the last month, it's been fairly busy. So the Wisconsin state legislature has passed a bill that implements the act effective from January next year. The Arizona state legislature has amended parts of it, stating that licensees engaged in the business of money transmission must issue consumer fraud warnings. The governor of Iowa has signed into law House File 2262, amending the state's money transmission regulations to provide a licensing exemption for an agent of the payer or for the purposes of providing payroll processing services. As well as Kansas has amended and repealed parts of its money transmission regulations. And finally, the governor of Maine has approved the Maine, like this regulation needed another M in it, the Maine Money Transmission Modernization Act. That is a mouthful, effective from July the 16th this year. So, if you're a money services business and you're operating in the US, there's a few things there to be mindful of as you go about updating your policies. Now, back to the topic of open banking and going north of the border. I think, again, one of the things you maybe touched on in that webinar last week was Canada and its open banking sort of announcement that it's made there. So I think the government there sort of announced in its budget proposal that it would essentially be creating some space for a framework for the implementation of open banking.
I think this is definitely a long time coming in Canada. People have been talking about this for quite a few years. I guess it's the same as what it's been in the US with the CFPB. So, firms will be incredibly happy that Canada's actually jumping ahead now and seems very, very committed. And I think it's also cross-party. So they have got an election coming up later this year or early next year. I can't remember exactly. But I think that both of the main parties are very keen to get open banking up and running.
Fantastic. And I know the US has also got some open banking stuff kind of going through that people are working hard on.
That's it. I mean, hopefully, I think we're hearing we might hear something this summer in terms of the wider piece of open banking, which will be federal level. So it will be exciting when it comes in, but no doubt there'll be some nuances for us to get under the hood of.
Excellent. And we've got a few minutes left, so we'll just touch on a couple of developments in South America. So in Brazil, the federal Senate in Brazil released a bill proposing changes to the general data protection law there. Essentially, the main parts of the bill is around the maximum amount for the fine, essentially going from 2% to 4% of the total revenue. It's worth just taking a look at that if you're financial institution operating in Brazil, because there are some new requirements in there, potential new requirements in there for you. And finally, in Colombia, the central bank has amended regulations for the interoperability of immediate low-value payment systems that provide payment services related to payments orders and immediate fund transfers. I think the main changes here include new operational standards for processing payment orders and guidelines on user experience, detection of fraud, etc. And I think we're just about out of time. So if you're watching this and you're thinking there are things that we haven't been covered, you'll be absolutely right. Given the sheer volume of change we see in regulation across the global payments industry, it would be impossible for us to cram all of this into one session. And that's why the world's leading payments businesses use Vixio Payments Compliance to aggregate, translate, and summarize regulatory updates from across the globe into one single source of truth. So feel free to get in touch with me, John, or Jimmy to learn more about that. Otherwise, we'll see you back here in a month's time for May's regulatory roundup. Stay compliant, everyone.